Fairly often I get requests for videos and forecasts on particular topics. I do try to get to them promptly, but the fact is I've got a list that's well over 100 plus my own projects, and a lot of stuff falls between the cracks. I also work really far in advance a lot of the time, so unless a video is time sensitive, it can be months before it comes up on my schedule. Still, recently I've noticed quite a few suggestions which are really interesting but may not be enough for a full video, so I thought I'd group them as a kind of Q&A. Let me know if you'd like this format and I may do it more often. I'm going to start with a question which is over a year old. Yes, I really do keep track of all of these, even if it takes me ages to get to them. This is from Black Hole Chan, who asked, can you make a video on the future of Captain Toad Treasure Tracker? Would love to hear your thoughts on a potential sequel. I know for sure it would only come out after the next 3D Mario, since both the Wii U and Switch versions had bonus levels respective to their 3D Mario console releases, 3D World for Wii U and Odyssey for Switch. Okay, so Captain Toad is kind of interesting. With the advent of the movies, anyone adjacent to the Mario universe has to have huge potential, and surely the 3D World levels will come over eventually, especially since 3D World has actually now been released on the Switch. I thought it would make a logical Nintendo Switch 2 edition, but actually Captain Toad Treasure Tracker has received a Day 1 upgrade, so what exactly are they waiting for? At the present time, EPD8 is perhaps the most critical development group of all the core Nintendo groups, and they've had effectively 3 releases last year: the Galaxy Duology working with Nintendo Software Technology, and of course Donkey Kong Bonanza. It appears that there are at least 3 groups there: a core group now working on Mario, the Donkey Kong branch team which perforated from the core group around 2020, and a group that appear to interface with Nintendo Software Technology. Now, Nintendo Software Technology, of course, worked on the 2018 Switch port of Captain Toad Treasure Tracker and have a good history of puzzle games with the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series and Snipperclip, so in many respects, they would be ideal candidates to run with the Captain Toad series. Another block is that Koichi Hayashida, the producer of the original Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, has now moved over to work with EPD10, the 2D Mario team. I'm not sure if this is a critical block to the development of more Captain Toad, as I rather suspect that in the next few years we're going to see a fairly substantial reconfiguration of the teams at Nintendo anyway, as it's been 11 years since the post-Iwata rejig, and so a new rejig is long overdue by Nintendo's historic standards. Plus, with a new building in 2028 and the likelihood that Koizumi will eventually succeed Takahashi, it would seem like the ideal point for a shake-up. Now, director Shinya Hirataki reportedly directed 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, although since the actual credits are rather opaque, not providing specific credits is difficult to say for absolute sure. He was credited as level design support on Donkey Kong Bonanza, probably reflecting that the game began with the unified EPD8 team before splitting down. Now, Hirataki's association with Nintendo Software Technology is certainly promising. Of course, even if he is working on a smaller branch game, is Captain Toad really the best option for Nintendo to develop right now? My hunch remains that something with Rosalina would be a better option at this stage, and look at how they pushed Princess Peach into her first game for 18 years with Showtime as an example of why they may decide to push particular characters in sync with the movies. Now, I do absolutely believe that Nintendo would like to come back to Captain Toad. It seems to be a passion project of the developers, and the original title followed fairly soon after 3D World, so it could be a palate cleanser after they finally lock down the next 3D Mario title. Also, at some point, I imagine, they are going to want to have some kind of Captain Toad movie tie-in, and so it makes sense to have a couple of games on the slate. I'm just not sure that I see new games anytime soon. On the other hand, with DLC already released and 3D World levels still to reveal, it feels like the kind of title that might be an easy addition to Nintendo Switch Online's DLC library in some form. Now, generally NSO DLC is for the absolute megaton games, but they may feel that it's worth experimenting with putting out some more niche DLC offers to see if it actually spikes a bit of interest in purchasing their past games. All told, therefore, I'd give a 10% chance of a new Captain Toad title by the end of 2028, but I think by the end of 2030, the chances of some kind of game, DLC, or project centered around Captain Toad have to be higher, perhaps even as high as 50%. Let's move on to another question, and this is from Stothosophy, who asks, do you think we could get a forecast of how likely ever Oasis is to return? I loved that game on 3DS, and it reviewed well, but no one seems to talk about it. So I've never played Ever Oasis myself, but it did look fun. Grezzo, the developers, are heavily invested in Nintendo development with a Zelda team and a separate port team behind Miitopia, but they also developed their original title Jet Dragon for mobile around 2024, so they aren't completely done with their own independent ventures as well. Ever Oasis is interesting because it was published by Nintendo, and Nintendo did have some involvement in developing it, with 2 assistant directors and a battle supervisor, as well as people working on graphics and UI. However, the director was Koichi Ishii, the founder of Grezzo, and my guess is that this was very much his passion project. With Ishii in his 60s, I'm not sure how much longer he'll be making games, and it seems plausible to me that the company of Grezzo could ultimately fold into Nintendo. Also, if he is wanting to experiment, perhaps he'll want to try different things, as he did with Jet Dragon, rather than returning to a particular past format. At this point, would there be a passionate voice in Nintendo or even outside for Ever Oasis? Well, on the one hand, it seems like a fairly straightforward potential 3DS port, but the sales ceiling seems to be on the low side, especially when compared to other potential Grezzo projects like 2D Zelda. My guess, therefore, is that there's a reasonable chance for the next few years, while Ishii is still around, that we could see more Ever Oasis. And of course, while there are still Nintendo staffers that have been heavily involved in shepherding these projects, plus while Grezzo can plausibly support a secondary team on it, we could still see something from this series. However, the longer we go without seeing it, the less likely I see a return, because ultimately it does seem to be something pushed by only a few core individuals. I would estimate a 30% chance of seeing Ever Oasis return in some form by the end of 2029. Mr. Super Smash 93 asks, what are your thoughts on the rumour of Nintendo buying XenoSaga from Bandai Namco? So this isn't something I'm enormously plugged into, but I saw a video on this from Nish Quick Pops, and as I understand it, the evidence is that XenoSaga was listed on the Bandai Namco website among a list of their franchises and then later removed. Now this feels pretty compelling to me if true, but even if not, it does make a huge amount of logistical sense. XenoSaga without Monolith Soft has very limited utility for Bandai Namco, while in Nintendo's hands it could be worth a fair amount. Nintendo are looking for long-term investments, while Bandai Namco seem to need cash now. It makes perfect sense for them to strike a deal, and I understand there were references to XenoSaga, which I must admit I've never played, in some recent Xenoblade games. It's obviously a personal thing for many of the Monolith Soft group, and so it seems like a real slam dunk for Nintendo. Now, this is kind of a helicopter judgment of things because I'm not really well versed on the intricacies of all this, and I completely reserve the right to change this response another time. But at present, it seems completely plausible a deal has been reached, and the only question is when we will see anything. I don't think Nintendo would splash cash without something specific in mind, and Monolith Soft do seem to have a regular cadence of remake projects coming out every 5 years. Xenosaga would make an obvious fit for this kind of slot, and I'd say it feels like a 70% chance that we'll hear something from Xenosaga, or in the general universe, from Nintendo by the end of 2030. On to the next question, and thanks for this one to Amadeus. By the end of Smash Ultimate's DLC, we started seeing issues with the game titles and changes to age rating board policies. In US regions, Nintendo couldn't refer to No More Heroes or Doom as game titles for reveal of certain V costumes. This continued in 2024 with the Fresh New Faces Spirit event. The Noah and Mio Spirit, for example, wasn't referred to as Xenoblade Chronicles Spirit in-game in any region, as far as I'm aware. This would show that the same changes have been made to rating boards in the EU and Japan. Do you think this could have a large impact in how Nintendo approaches T and M rated content in future Smash titles? So again, I don't really know the full context of this, and it's pretty hard to say for sure, so this is really just assumptions, and people can check my thinking if they have specific insights. This may be something that I do circle back to in a full video, but at present it feels like a difficult one to know exactly where to start researching, and so I'm going to put out my initial thoughts, and if other people have suggestions as to where I could look into for further information, please do share them in the comments below. However, I think we can infer some things about how these character picks seem to be being made. Sakurai says that Nintendo makes the choices for at least the DLC, while the core games seem to be mainly in Sakurai's court, but the fact is that the niceties of Japanese etiquette and respect aside, I can't believe that both Nintendo and Sakurai aren't heavily involved in all of the character pick decisions. Now, Sakurai has to make the characters playable, but Nintendo also has to see a value in them. I'm sure there's give and take, of course, just like with any professional relationship. Now, one thing Nintendo can do is handle all the legal obstacles, including regulatory clearances. I don't know exactly how these work, but I'm sure a major company like Nintendo would be keen to have contact in all the various regulatory bodies and would be sounding out different options to see how they can get to the ratings they require without having to go to the cost of having something submitted and possibly needing to be re-edited for resubmission. This would all be then fed back to the core team in Japan as part of their ongoing considerations for which characters they might use. So let's say that a character from an M-rated game, for argument's sake, let's say Emio, is someone that both Nintendo Company Limited in Japan and Sakurai are very keen to support and get into the game. The judgment would then have to be that the character has such incredible benefits to a new Smash game that these would outweigh the complexities of potentially this pushing up the rating, or they think they can find ways to fudge things through to get the character over the line in the various territories where the regulations are strictest. This would be part of a negotiation, but of course, all aspects of Smash will be under constant negotiation as an inevitable byproduct of having so many different IPs in play. So Nintendo does have the infrastructure to do this. Now, if it came to it, would Nintendo risk raising the game's rating to put a character in? I suspect, given Smash's position as a party title that many children play, it would be a fairly hard line for Nintendo, but I doubt it would get to that point since it will be a corporate priority for Nintendo to head off these kinds of issues at a point long before the characters even enter full development. If anything, it might push characters to DLC that might otherwise come early on, but likely if there were characters vetoed for such reasons, we probably never know, since Nintendo wouldn't want to damage their relationships with censors by blaming them so publicly for the absence of a particular character. So all told, yes, I think it probably could have an impact, but it's very difficult to say for certain because so much of this will be wrapped up in things that are deeply secret at Nintendo and regulatory discussions that are probably going to be done behind closed doors to a large degree. As I say, this is just my initial thoughts, so I would welcome any further comments on this, and I'm happy to revisit this in a subsequent video if there's more that can meaningfully be uncovered. Okay, let's move on to the last question for today. LoneCom685 writes, you should do a video on the possibility of Nintendo working with indie studios like they did with Cadence of Hyrule. Imagine a Donkey Kong 4 or Ice Climbers 2, for example. Smaller games that are easy to make, cheap for the consumer, and could still come out for Switch 1. Plus, they would be investing in possible future partners and even long-forgotten IPs. The risk would be much lower. Now, in certain respects, this is a really good idea, but with so many indie studios, it's pretty difficult for me to speculate with any specificity, and I really don't know the indie game scene all that well. For this reason, I'm probably unlikely to do a full video on it, but I will give my initial thoughts here. I do think there are some general principles we can look at. First of all, from 2017 to 2020, Nintendo did have quite a number of team-ups with various smaller developers, not just Cadence of Hyrule, but also, coordinated seemingly through Nintendo software technology, Snipperclips, The Stretchers, and Good Job, where the Redmond team seemed to be interfacing with various international small-time developers. At this time, Nintendo was keen to push its so-called Nindies line, but I note a recent Kit and Krista comment where they observed that the person at Nintendo of America driving the Nindies line was told to stop because the risk to the corporate brand was too great, and it's certainly the case that indie-related tie-ins have come to a grinding halt this decade. I suspect there are a few things going on here. Firstly, we know that Nintendo can be very difficult to get on the hook at the best of times. Check out how majors were kept waiting a year before being given the green light for Famicom Detective Club. Brace Yourself Games had Spike Chunsoft as an intermediary to help make things work with Nintendo. And this is actually quite significant. You see, indie studios, by dint of their size, are going to have very low capacity to adapt quickly and absorb lots of changes, and Nintendo has very high standards and quite slow internal processes. You can understand why with Spike Chunsoft involved, it was a little bit easier to accept that the Cadence of Hyrule team could work on the Zelda property, but I'm not sure that this is going to be the case in many circumstances. It's simply not plausible for these studios in general to have the kind of responsiveness and patience that Nintendo might want them to have. Also, Nintendo builds relationships for the long term, but that's a harder sell with smaller indie teams which may well disband or reform in different combinations, whereas more mature developers are likely to be ongoing bets for the future. Putting a lot of effort into building a working relationship with smaller teams is likely to be riskier for Nintendo, although, of course, the flip side is that they do have particular trust in significant individuals, and if there were a particular indie developer, Toby Fox, say, who they felt that they could really work with and they had huge respect for, then this is something that they might pursue. Now, it's true that the games themselves may be smaller, but this also affects the sales ceiling. I'm not sure it's a priority for them to offer lower priced versions of their core franchises. They want these franchises to hold their value. I rather wonder how they feel about the Mario plus Rabbids games being so robustly and quickly discounted, and note that this partnership was another one struck during the mid 2010s when Nintendo was courting risks far more. The fact is, Nintendo desperately needed games for the 2017 to 2019 period when they were transitioning all their development efforts to the Nintendo Switch, and so projects like these, Snipper Clips, even the Star Fox cameo in Starlink, all served a very important purpose then that I'm just not sure feels as vital now. I think, especially in the age of Switch 2, indie partnerships probably aren't an internal priority, and anyone who pitched would find it difficult to close with Nintendo. Now, that's not to say that more indie link-ups won't happen, and I could definitely see significant franchises being tried out under these kinds of circumstances. Smaller studios like Velan on Mario Kart Home Circuit show that Nintendo can and will roll the dice under the right circumstances. But on balance, I'm skeptical that this will happen more than very occasionally. I would give a 30% chance of an indie game featuring first-party characters debuting on the Switch or Switch 2 by the end of 2028. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this particular video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you as ever to the patron supporters of the channel who really do help to keep this show on the road. And if you have any further comments, please drop them below. But otherwise, I'll just say thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.